Hello friends, and welcome to today's Sutta class. We will start with the Namo Tassa as usual. Feel free to join in if you like. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. So, welcome to today's Sutta class. And today we continue our topic about Buddhist conflict resolution strategies, where we talk about the conflict at Kosambi or the schism at Kosambi. This is a story from the Buddha's time where two senior monks started quarreling about how to clean the toilet. And then the whole thing got totally out of hand. And eventually the entire sangha at Kosambi got involved in the conflict, and they all took sides, and the sangha split into two parts. So there was a full-blown schism over from this very tiny incident to this huge schism and massive bad karma of creating a split in the sangha. And we have studied over the course of the last few weeks the Buddha's response to this conflict, how he tried to resolve the issue. And we saw that at first he approached both sides and tried to show them the bigger picture, tried to make them see the other person's point of view, tried to get them to reconcile. And when that failed and when everything escalated even more to the point where people were verbally and physically attacking each other, then he tried to physically separate them to make sure that there's less points of contact between the two groups, so that the defilements don't constantly get fueled more and more, and the conflict gets bigger and bigger. And then the Buddha started teaching them. First, he taught them the Kosambi Sutta, which we read a few weeks ago, where he taught them about communal harmony, 6 factors for communal harmony, and then the higher stages of the path. So how the development and the training in the path and in those 6 factors will lead them to stream entry. So trying to show them the benefits of reconciliation and the higher stages of the path that they could attain if they reconcile. And again, that didn't work. People were too much invested, emotionally invested in their anger and in that conflict at that point. So the Buddha didn't get through to them. And then he changed his approach, and he saw that they were no longer able to process rational ideas and a rational Dhamma talk. So he told them a story, an Indian folk tale about a prince, Prince Digavu. This is the story we read last time. And by this folk tale, with this like children's story, he tried to get them at a completely different level, at a much more basic level, with a very simple message. And the message was that, like, if you respond to anger with anger, if you respond to hate with hate, it creates a vicious cycle, and it just fuels more and more hate. And you have to respond to anger with metta, with loving kindness, in order to overcome this cycle. And again, even this very basic children's tale didn't get through to the monks. They insisted on their conflict. So today we will see the Buddha's one last attempt at teaching them with a very short poem. And then he's giving up on them and he's walking away, and he's visiting some other communities that practice, or some other monks actually, one single monk, one community, that practice in line with the teachings, and that have, like the community has a huge amount of communal harmony. It's very, very beautiful, and how they then are able to attain the higher stages on the path. And this is the sutta that we are reading today. The Upakilesa Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya, number 128. And this sutta is a very, very beautiful contrast to the Kosambi Sutta. So it picks up the Kosambi Sutta and it picks up the theme of the Kosambi Sutta and then shows us the exact opposite, the most ideal, the most perfect community, and how the monks are practicing there and how they are developing on the path. And because they develop quite deep meditation, the Buddha gives them a very beautiful teaching on the very subtle defilements that can occur in the mind just before you enter into very deep absorption states. So that those very subtle defilements that can derail meditation when you're at a very deep point. And this is a fairly unique teaching. It doesn't really occur in many other places in the canon. So this is very special. It's also very beautiful. And for this reason, it's called the Upakilesa Sutta. So Upakilesa, the subtle defilements. Probably you know that kilesa means defilement. Upakilesa means those subtle defilements that can derail the mind just before you enter into deep states of meditation. And today, this is the sutta we are reading. Probably we're going to split this into two parts. So we're reading the part about communal harmony today and the part about the Upakilesas probably next time. If you want to read along, I've put a link into the live chat. The link in the live chat is to Bhante Sujato's translation. I will be reading from Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, but unfortunately, it's not on Sutta Central, so I couldn't give you a link to that. But feel free to read along with Bhante Sujato's translation if you want to. So this is the Upakilesa Sutta, called The Imperfections by Bhikkhu Bodhi, and it's called The Corruptions by Bhante Sujato. So the sutta begins. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Kosambi in Gosita's park. Now, on that occasion, the bhikkhus at Kosambi had taken to quarreling and brawling and were deep in disputes, stabbing each other with verbal daggers. Then a certain bhikkhu went to the Blessed One, and after paying homage to him, he stood at one side and said, Venerable Sir, the bhikkhus here at Kosambi have taken to quarreling and brawling and are deep in disputes, stabbing each other with verbal daggers. It would be good, Venerable Sir, if the Blessed One would go to those bhikkhus out of compassion. The Blessed One consented in silence. So this is the same introduction that we have seen before in the other suttas that we have read, and even in this sutta, the bhikkhus are still quarreling, so we still have the same introduction. Then the Blessed One went to those bhikkhus and said to them, Enough, bhikkhus, let there be no quarreling, brawling, wrangling, or dispute. When this was said, a certain bhikkhu said to the Blessed One, Wait, Venerable Sir, let the Blessed One, the Lord of the Dhamma, live at ease, devoted to a pleasant abiding here and now. We are the ones who will be responsible for this quarreling, brawling, wrangling, and dispute. For a second time and for a third time, the Blessed One said, Enough, bhikkhus, let there be no quarreling, brawling, wrangling, or dispute. For a third time, that bhikkhu said to the Blessed One, Wait, Venerable Sir, let the Blessed One, the Lord of the Dhamma, live at ease, devoted to a pleasant abiding here and now. We are the ones who will be responsible for this quarreling, brawling, wrangling, and dispute. So this is, again, exactly the same thing as we have seen before. The Buddha is going to them, he's trying to teach them, and the bhikkhus are entirely unwilling to listen to him. And not only are they unwilling to listen to him, they actually send him away. So the level of defilement and the level of delusion that they're under is quite remarkable, to the point that they're not even willing to listen to the Buddha, to the point that they're actually sending the Buddha away, telling him, go away, live at ease somewhere else, and let us here take the responsibility for our quarreling. So they're basically telling him, yeah, we know that we're quarreling, and we know that's kind of unwholesome. We will bear the consequence for that. We will be responsible. We will take the bad karma that comes from that. So they're kind of aware what they're doing, but they still stubbornly cling to that. So their anger, their defilements are so strong that they no longer can see what they're actually doing. They are completely acting in a completely delusional way, basically. And again, this is what we have seen in the other suttas already. So at this point, the Buddha has already taught them the Kosambi Sutta. He has already taught them the story of Prince Digavu. If you remember the story of Prince Digavu, this was a prince whose parents were killed. The king and the queen were killed by a hostile king. And then when the prince had the chance to take revenge on the hostile king and kill him, he actually didn't kill him, but he practiced compassion. He let him live. And then out of gratitude, they reconciled. And so the cycle of violence was overcome. And in the future, they lived together peacefully. And they even established friendly relations between their two kingdoms. So that was the main message of that teaching. And now, at this point, the Buddha sees that he has tried everything and they're still sending him away. They're still not willing to listen to him. So the sutta continues. Then, when it was morning, the Blessed One dressed, and taking his bowl and outer robe, he entered Kosambi for alms. When he had wandered for alms in Kosambi and had returned from his alms round after his meal, he set his resting place in order, took his bowl and outer robe, and while standing, uttered these stanzas. So here we see the Buddha is preparing to leave Kosambi. He's going for alms, and after that, he's cleaning up his kuti, setting everything in order so that he doesn't have to return and look after the place. And he's taking his bowl, he's taking his robe, and which means he's preparing to leave and to go somewhere else. And before he leaves, he's giving one last very brief teaching. This time he's giving it in the form of a poem or a few stanzas. So one very brief, very pithy, very short teaching. One last time trying to pierce through their delusions, but he already knows it's kind of futile. He is already preparing to leave. And he says, when many voices shout at once, none considers himself a fool. Though the sangha is being split, none thinks himself to be at fault. They have forgotten thoughtful speech. They talk obsessed by words alone. Uncurb their mouths, they brawl at will. None knows what leads him so to act. He abused me, he struck me, he defeated me, he robbed me. In those who harbor thoughts like these, hatred will never be allayed. He abused me, he struck me, he defeated me, he robbed me. In those who do not harbor thoughts like these, hatred will readily be allayed. For in this world, hatred is never allayed by further acts of hate. It is allayed by non-hatred. This is the fixed and ageless law. Those others do not recognize that here we should restrain ourselves, but those wise ones who realize this at once end all their enmity. The poem still continues, but let's talk about this first part first. And here the Buddha obviously comments on the state of the sangha in Kosambi. And he points out that at this point, they are no longer listening to each other. They're not only are they no longer listening to the Buddha, they're also no longer listening to each other. There's just many voices all shouting out at once. And this is what happens when we are under the sway of defilements. We no longer reflect on our action. It's just the defilements are so strong. The anger is boiling inside ourselves. It's such an unpleasant emotion that we just have to vent it outside, that we cannot contain it inside ourselves. It just comes out. It just needs to be voiced. It just needs to be thrown at the other person. And at this point, really, there is no way to resolve the conflict because you're not listening to each other. We have this painful sensation inside, and we're just throwing it out at each other and just fueling each other's anger. And because we're not listening, and because we're not actually interested to resolve the thing, we're just interested to get rid of this really painful feeling that is boiling inside us. There's really no way to find a way out of the conflict at this point. And it's really like we are completely on autopilot. We are not mindful. We don't know what we're doing. We are completely under the sway of those delusions and those defilements. So we're acting entirely foolishly, but we don't, as the Buddha says, we don't consider ourselves a fool. We don't really see what we are doing. And it gets to the point that the sangha is being split. So it's at the point like where normally if we were thinking rationally, and if those bhikkhus had been thinking rationally, they would never have gone that far over like a tiny issue such as how to clean a toilet. To create a schism in the sangha, everybody knows this is really, really bad karma. So if you were thinking rationally, and if those bhikkhus had been thinking rationally, obviously that would never have happened. But because their anger is boiling so strongly, they couldn't really see what they were doing, and they were willing to go that far. And we have to remember those people who started the conflict, those were very, very senior members of the sangha, a Vinaya expert and a sutra expert. So having been ordained for a long time, having a lot of knowledge, having a lot of students and so on. So not just people who were newly ordained, people who have been training on the Dhamma path for a long time. And people who were really, really committed to the path. People who have given their entire life to the practice of the path. And even then, the defilements were so strong that they were willing to go so far to the point that they actually created a schism in the Sangha. And so this is what anger can do to us. So what the Buddha is pointing out here is that if we feel that anger is arising in us, then really this is the time to be extremely mindful, to be super, super mindful, to make sure that we don't fall into this trap and give into our anger and just vent it out and just throw it at the other person and get into this state where all the voices are just shouting at once and where nobody's able to listen to each other. Because at that point, even for somebody who is as wholesome as those senior bhikkhus, they were no longer able to control what was happening. So this is a very, very strong warning to everybody, what anger can do and how mindful and how careful we have to be when we feel anger arising in us. Yeah, and the Buddha points out that we get obsessed by those words. We forget everything. We completely lose our mindfulness, and we don't know. Like afterwards, when we calm down, we don't really know what has driven us, why we acted in that way. So again, this is the danger of defilements. This is the danger, especially of anger, of hatred. And then the Buddha points out how this anger is getting fueled, how this cycle happens. And he points out that we cling on to those thoughts of how other people wrong us. Here the Buddha says, he abused me, he struck me, he defeated me, he robbed me. So when something bad happens to us, then we constantly think it over and over and ruminate on it in our mind. And we're not able to let it go. So this thing might have happened 5 minutes ago, or this thing might have happened a month or even a year or 10 years ago, and we still remember it very clearly. And whenever we think about it, we get more and more angry with that other person, and we are unable to let it go. And whenever we meet that other person, we're still angry with them. And obviously, that's an entirely foolish way of living one's life. Because that other person has harmed you one time. But when you keep on thinking about it, each and every time you keep on harming yourself, each and every time you keep on thinking these really unpleasant thoughts, you're making yourself miserable, you're giving yourself all these unpleasant feelings again. You're cultivating this really unwholesome karma of the anger that you constantly trigger again and again in your mind. So the other person has harmed you one time, but you keep on harming yourself for months and for years on end with that thing. So actually you are harming yourself much more than the other person has ever harmed you. So obviously if you practice in that way, the anger just will get stronger and you have no way to reconcile with that other person again. So the Buddha points out that if we cling to thoughts like this, that's a really stupid way of handling such a situation. But if you don't cling to thoughts like these, then your anger, your hatred can be allayed. So you can get out of this vicious cycle of triggering more and more anger. And then you can actually stop harming yourself and stop getting involved in all these negative emotions. So sometimes people feel like they have to cling to these negative emotions because otherwise the other person wins, or otherwise they feel like the other person is a bad person, so they don't deserve to be forgiven or something. But even if you don't like the other person, just for your own sake, you should let this go because you're making yourself miserable. So just for your own sake, even if you don't care about the other person at all, just for your own sake, you should let this go. Even better is, of course, if you can see that the other person is also suffering. They did this. When they did this, they also had negative mind states. They also created a lot of bad karma for themselves. They also were suffering so much, and they will suffer even more in the future because of the bad karma that they created when they did this. So if we are mindful, if we can reflect properly, then we will see that the best way to think about the other person is not angry thoughts, but actually thoughts of compassion for all the bad karma that they created for themselves, for all the suffering that is going to come to them for this. But even if we don't care about the other person, if we're not able to think in that way, just to protect ourselves and to not create bad karma for ourselves, we should let those kind of thoughts go. So if we let those go, it's good for ourselves. It's also good for the other person. And then the Buddha repeats the teaching that he tried to teach already in the folk tale, the children's story about the prince Digavu that we read last time. Hatred is never allayed by further acts of hate. Hatred is allayed by non-hatred or by loving kindness. This is the fixed and ageless law, obviously. We can only break the cycle of violence if we don't commit violence ourselves, if we forgive the other person and break that vicious circle. So the Buddha says, the wise ones who realize this, they at once end all their enmity. So if we are wise, if we realize what we are doing to ourselves and to others, then immediately we would not fuel our anger. Immediately we would let go all of the thoughts of hatred, of enmity, of ill will towards other people, because that is only creating bad karma, only creating suffering for ourselves. So at once, if we're wise, at once we will let all these thoughts go. And then the Buddha continues, breakers of bones and murderers, those who steal cattle, horses, wealth, those who pillage the entire realm, when even these can act together, why can you not do so too? If one can find a worthy friend, a virtuous, steadfast companion, then overcome all threats of danger and walk with him content and mindful. But if one finds no worthy friend, no virtuous, steadfast companion, then as a king leaves his conquered realm, walk like a tusker in the woods alone. Better it is to walk alone. There is no companionship with fools. Walk alone and do no evil, at ease like a tusker in the woods. So in the first stanza here, the Buddha points out that even the most hardened criminals, the most, let's say, the most evil people on earth, the murderers, the robbers, those who pillage entire countries, those people can band together, those people can work together, those people can accomplish their evil deeds together. So even these people, even though they have so much ill will inside them, and they cause so much destruction, they make so much bad karma, even they are able to work together to overcome their differences and to band together for a common goal. So if even such people can work together, how is it that people in the sangha cannot work together, cannot reconcile? And how is it that those people who have all these lofty goals and lofty aspirations and who try to create only good karma and who try to be good people and who made the commitment to the Dharma, who've given their entire life to the Dharma, how is it possible that those people create a schism in the sangha and are not able, even after so many weeks and so many teachings, to overcome this conflict? And then the Buddha ends this poem with 3 stanzas that are quite famous. They're found elsewhere in the canon too. Most prominently, I think they are found in the Kakavisana Sutta, which is the sutta in the Sutta Nipata about the rhinoceros or the rhinoceros horn, which has this very memorable stanza in this very memorable line in every single stanza: walk alone like a rhinoceros. So this is a very famous sutta, with really many stanzas that tells us that if we want to practice the path and we really want to make progress, then it's best to go into solitude and to practice alone in solitude, in good conditions with a very wholesome intention. But the main intention, or the main purpose of this sutta is to tell us to practice in solitude. For that reason, every stanza ends with the line, wander alone like a rhinoceros. And these 3 stanzas that are included in this Rhinoceros Sutra are the only ones that do not have this, this last line about the rhinoceros. So these stand out even in that sutta there. And these are the only ones that don't necessarily tell you to be all alone. So these are the only ones that talk about having companions. And here the Buddha says, if you find a worthy friend, a virtuous, steadfast companion, then you can be together with that person. So don't just be together with any kind of person because you don't want to be alone, because you want to have company, or for whatever reason. So in that case, it's much better to be alone. But if you have a worthy friend, somebody who is also practicing the path, somebody where you can be helpful to each other, somebody who's also virtuous and steadfast in practicing the Dharma, then you should stay with that person together, content and mindful. And because then together it's easier to overcome threats and dangers and all the obstacles and challenges that might occur on the path. But if you have no such friend, then the Buddha says, as a king leaves his conquered realm, walk like a tusker in the woods alone. So if you don't have such a friend, then it's much better to do things on your own rather than staying with people who might lead you astray, who might start a conflict, like the bhikkhus in Kosambi. And as we have seen at the beginning, this was a conflict between only 2 people in the Sangha, but eventually every single person in the Sangha had to take sides because the Sangha was split into 2. So you had to be either in one side or the other. You couldn't be anywhere in the middle. You had to take a side. So if you're in such a situation, obviously it's much better to walk away, to do your own thing, and not to get caught up in other people's problems and in other people's conflicts. And of course, the Buddha says better it is to walk alone. There is no companionship with fools. Walk alone and do no evil, at ease like a tusker in the woods. So even like we have to understand, even if this isn't our conflict, as soon as we take sides, as soon as we somehow get involved, we are already starting to create unwholesome karma. We are already starting to think about all these unwholesome things. Emotions might come up, anger or ill will might arise. The more we stay in such situations, the more difficult it is to be mindful and not to get entangled in these kind of issues. So to protect ourselves, it's much better to walk away. As the Buddha says, there's no companionship with fools. So, and we remember the Buddha is now walking away too. Even the Buddha, having tried everything, has decided there's nothing he can do. Sometimes people are just not willing to listen. And also, just to keep in mind, the Buddha isn't walking away forever. He is not closing the door entirely on those monastics, but he just sees that at this point in time, there's nothing he can do. At a later point in time, when those bhikkhus will come to him, we will see that in a few weeks, he's obviously more than willing to teach them again and to help them to reconcile once they are actually ready to do that. But at this point, the Buddha sees that there's nothing that he can do, and therefore he is walking away. So then, having uttered these stanzas while standing, the Blessed One went to the village of Balakalonakara. On that occasion, the Venerable Bhagu was living at the village of Balakalonakara. When the Venerable Bhagu saw the Blessed One coming in the distance, he prepared a seat and set out water for washing the feet. The Blessed One sat down on the seat made ready and washed his feet. The Venerable Bhagu paid homage to the Blessed One and sat down at one side, and the Blessed One said to him, I hope you're keeping well, Bhikkhu. I hope you're comfortable. I hope you're not having any trouble getting alms food. I'm keeping well, Blessed One. I'm comfortable, and I am not having any trouble getting alms food." Then the Blessed One instructed, urged, roused, and gladdened the Venerable Bhagu with talk on the Dhamma, after which he rose from his seat and went to the eastern bamboo park. So here now the Buddha is leaving Kosambi and going to the village of Balakalonakara. So this is obviously just a name, but it also has a meaning. So this actually means the village of Balaka, the salt maker. So Balaka is a name. Lona means salt and Kara means making. So Balaka, the salt maker's village. And so Buddha isn't just going to some kind of suburb of Kosambi, staying very close to those bhikkhus, just, putting a small kind of tiny distance between himself and them. Actually, back in the day in India, the distances between inhabited areas were much greater than what we think about when we think about cities and villages today. And India was very densely forested. And usually the distance between one village to the next or one village to the next city would be about 1 day's walk. So the Buddha has walked for quite a distance. He's put quite a distance between himself and those monks. So he has walked at least for 1 day to get to Balakalonakara. Maybe Balakalonakara is even further than that. I'm not quite sure. But this is quite a distance already that he has put between himself and those quarreling monks. And so the first thing he does when he leaves the quarreling monks in Kosambi is visit a monk who's practicing solitary. So a monk who's actually putting into practice what the Buddha just talked about, walking away, being on one's own, practicing by oneself if one doesn't have a good companion. So Bhagu is doing exactly that. And for that reason, the Blessed One, the Buddha, is checking up on him to see if that actually helps his practice, or if that is equally bad as staying in Kosambi. So, of course, Bhagu, practicing well, has a completely different reaction to the Buddha than the monks at Kosambi. The monks in Kosambi have asked him to go away. They were unwilling to listen to him, and they discarded his instructions, and they told him that they still want to keep on quarreling, even though the Buddha repeatedly asked him to stop their fighting. So Bhagu is exactly the opposite. When he sees the Buddha, even from a distance, he immediately prepares a seat and he sets out water. So he's trying everything to make the Buddha feel welcome and feel valued when he arrives there. And Bhagu very attentively listens to the Buddha. He pays homage. He sits down to one side and he listens when the Buddha speaks. And the first thing the Buddha checks the first thing the Buddha asks about is whether Bhagu is living comfortably and keeping well, and if he's having any trouble getting alms food or not. So before the Buddha talks about any kinds of deep Dhamma states or very profound teachings, he just wants to make sure that the person that's in front of him isn't in any kind of material need or in any kind of psychologically imbalanced state. So obviously, as a monk, Bhagu should live quite simply with few material possessions and so on. But still, as a monk, he has some very basic needs. Most notably, he needs alms food every day. He needs a shelter and various other, like what we call the 4 requisites. So these are the minimum standards that need to be met in order to actually be able to fruitfully practice the Dharma. Because if you worry all the time about your survival, if your bare survival isn't like assured, if you don't know that you get enough food every day, if you feel hungry, if you feel worn out and tired all the time, then obviously your mind isn't prepared for deep states of samadhi. Obviously, your mind is just worried and exhausted all the time. So the first thing the Buddha checks is whether Bhagu has enough to eat, and whether he's generally in a good and comfortable state. And Bagu confirms that he's well and comfortable and mentally and physically healthy and has everything he needs for his very simple life. And only at this point, when the Buddha has checked that Bagu has everything he needs, does the Buddha give him the Dhamma talk. So we see here there's a big contrast between the bhikkhus at Kosambi and Bagu, in that Bagu is actually paying respect. He's attentively listening to the Buddha, and he's living in a comfortable way. Unlike the bhikkhus at Kosambi who are quarreling, he is actually comfortable, and for that reason he can actually make something out of his monastic life. And so the Buddha very happily gives him a Dhamma talk. Unfortunately, the Dhamma talk is not preserved. Of course, that would have been very interesting to know what the Buddha talks about here. But unfortunately, this is not preserved. And then after having met Bagu, the Buddha goes to the Eastern Bamboo Park. So the Eastern Bamboo Park also is not in Balakalonakara. So that means the Buddha again walks quite a distance to the next place where he meets the next group of monks. So now on that occasion, the Venerable Anuruddha, the Venerable Nandya, and the Venerable Kimbila were living at the Eastern Bamboo Park. So these three bhikkhus, they occur in other suttas as well as a group. And they are famous for being the ideal group of friends, for being the perfect community. So they are the most striking contrast between the monks at Kosambi that are so deluded that they are actually causing a schism, and those three friends who are the most harmonious group, the most perfect monastic community. And obviously, they are put together in one sutta here, and the Buddha is visiting them one after the other in order to actually really bring out the difference between like the worst way of living a monastic life and the best way of living a monastic life. So the park keeper saw the Blessed One coming in the distance and told him, "Do not enter this park, recluse. There are 3 clansmen here seeking their own good. Do not disturb them." The Venerable Anuruddha heard the park keeper speaking to the Blessed One and told him, "Friend park keeper, do not keep the Blessed One out. It is our teacher, the Blessed One, who has come." Then the Venerable Anuruddha went to the Venerable Nandya and the Venerable Kimbala and said, "Come out, Venerable Sirs, come out. Our teacher, the Blessed One, has come." Then all 3 went to meet the Blessed One. One took his bowl and outer robe, one prepared a seat, and one set out water for washing the feet. The Blessed One sat down on the seat made ready and washed his feet. Then those 3 venerable ones paid homage to the Blessed One and sat down at one side, and the Blessed One said to them, "I hope you're keeping well, Anuruddha. I hope you're comfortable. I hope you're not having any trouble getting alms food." "We are keeping well, Blessed One. We are comfortable, and we are not having any trouble getting alms food." So here we see the Buddha arriving at the Eastern Bamboo Park with those 3 friends. And at first, the Buddha is denied access to the park because the park keeper is trying to protect the practice of those 3 monks. Of course, the park keeper doesn't know that the Buddha is the teacher of the 3 monks. So here again, we see that the difference, how the lay people react, or how the lay people deal with those 3 monks as opposed to the ones in Kosambi. So in Kosambi, as we have seen before, the conflict among the monks was so severe that even the lay people split into 2 factions and aligned themselves with the different groups of monks. So even the lay people couldn't remain neutral and got enmeshed in this conflict. And we know that eventually the conflict, we have talked about this in our first session, will be resolved because the lay people put their foot down and the lay people stop paying respect to the monks and the lay people stop feeding the monks. So the reaction that the lay people have towards the monks in Kosambi is very, very different from the reaction of the park keeper here. The park keeper is extremely inspired by those 3 monks, so, to the point that he is really trying to protect their practice to make sure that there's no disturbance. And so to the point that he's actually actively trying to stop other people from entering the park so that those 3 monks would not be disturbed, would be left entirely at peace to fully focus on their practice. So even the reaction of the lay people is entirely the opposite to what is happening in Kosambi. But then, of course, Anuruddha sees the Buddha and lets him in, of course. And again, we see the reaction of the 3 friends to the Buddha's arrival is entirely different from the monks in Kosambi. They are actually really delighted. They set out water, they prepare a seat, they all come and pay respect, and they really want to interact with the Buddha. They really want to hear teaching from him. They're not going to send him away, and they're not going to disrespect his teachings. And of course, the first thing, again, what the Buddha checks is whether or not they're keeping well, whether they're comfortable, whether or not they're having any trouble getting alms food, exactly the same as he was talking to Bagu just now in the village of Balakolonakara. And so one tiny detail that we see here is that the Buddha seems to be talking only to Anuruddha here when he says, I hope you're all keeping well, Anuruddha. I hope you're comfortable, and so on. So in the Pali, actually, we can see very clearly that he's talking to all 3 of the monks. He's not just singling out one of them. He's talking to all 3 because in the Pali, this is a plural. So he's actually talking to the Anuruddhas, or to Anuruddha and his friends, or Anuruddha and his group. So he is talking to the most senior of the 3 in a plural to make sure that he's including all the other 2 monks as well. Of course, in English, we cannot make a plural out of Anuruddha. So we can either put it in a singular, or we could say Anuruddha and his friends, to make sure to understand that all the monks are included here, not just one. And this will be the same throughout the sutta. So whenever the Buddha says Anuruddha, it actually means Anuruddha and his group. And after the Buddha has found out that the monks are materially and mentally well and healthy, he continues and he asks, I hope, Anuruddha, that you're all living in concord, with mutual appreciation, without disputing, blending like milk and water, viewing each other with kindly eyes. And surely, Venerable Sir, we are living in concord with mutual appreciation, without disputing, blending like milk and water, viewing each other with kindly eyes. So after checking that they are mentally and physically well, the next thing that the Buddha wants to check before giving a Dhamma talk is, since they are a group, they are not a solitary monk such as Bagu, are they living together in concord, or are they quarreling? Because if they're quarreling, obviously there's no point giving them a deep Dhamma talk. If they're quarreling, the first thing that needs to be done is to resolve the conflict. But Anuruddha confirms that they are living in concord. They are living with mutual appreciation, without disputing. They're blending like milk and water. So this has actually, I think, become a fixed expression, I think, in Buddhist circles. If people are really, really in harmony, then they are like milk and water, blending like milk and water. And this obviously comes from this sutta here, from Anuruddha and his group, from the ideal community. And they're viewing each other with kindly eyes. So very, very beautifully, a very, very good life together. And I see that we have already been going for 45 minutes. Actually, I've wanted to get a little bit further today and talk a little bit more about how they live together and how they establish this communal harmony. But I don't want to go through this halfway and then only go through half of their community life. So I think it might be better if we end here for today and read about their beautiful community next time. I hope that's okay with you. So I think I'm going to end the sutta reading for today. And if you have any questions or comments, then please type them in the chat and I will do my best to answer them. And I hope you're looking forward to next week when we study Anuruddha and his friends a little bit more, because I think this is a really, really inspiring passage here. So let's see if there are any questions in the chat. Dan says, hatred is never allayed by further acts of hate. This verse is epic. Yes, I agree. And what brought me to the Dharma? 7 years ago, a conflict I could not resolve, and then found a guided metta meditation on YouTube. Yeah, so metta meditation is obviously the best antidote to anger that is out there. So whenever the hindrance of ill will or anger or hatred arises, then metta meditation is what should be practiced. And if you remember of the 6 factors for communal harmony, or 6 principles for communal harmony that we talked about in the Kosambi Sutta, the first 3 were exclusively dealing with metta. So metta by body, by speech, and by mind in the 3 kinds of actions. The first 3 factors that contribute to communal harmony. And of course, if there are people out there, I think many people out there probably have anger as their most prominent defilement, or ill will is often much more prominent than, for example, greed or delusion, then metta practice is very important and should be included really in our daily practice. Because when the anger is already arisen, then it's, as we have talked about today, it's very hard to remain mindful. It's very hard to practice metta. But if we make metta practice a habit that we cultivate all the time, even if there's no anger in our mind at that particular moment, then when anger actually arises, we already have a strong habit pattern of metta practice. So it's much easier. When the habit pattern is already formed by our daily practice, it's much easier to actually practice it when the need arises, when the anger is there, when the conflict has arisen. So for that reason, metta practice is really important and should really be done every day. Yeah. And Dan also says, I'm incredibly grateful. I think I must have been protected by someone with a strong practice. I don't know who it was, but a lot of these ideas were seeded and I found a way out. Yeah, it's good. I'm glad that you found a way out of your conflict and that it brought you to the Dharma. So sometimes these intense kinds of suffering that are caused by conflicts are the cause for people to actually start practicing the Dharma. So when we have intense suffering, then we understand the 4 Noble Truths and we understand how important it is to actually practice. So sometimes even those bad situations can have a good outcome because they can trigger practice in us. And Dan continues, this Dhamma is so protective of harmony and good relations between people and so conducive to happiness. I hope to be able to repay the benefit I received if I am lucky. So yeah, I think if we practice well, then of course we have a lot of chances to practice metta by body, speech, and mind. So we give back to other people. And as I mentioned before, if we cultivate negative mind states that harms ourselves and it harms others, if we cultivate metta, obviously that's a benefit to ourselves, but it's also a benefit to all the beings that we're in contact with. So naturally, it will be helpful or be repaying the benefit that we gain from our practice. So the more we practice, the more benefit we have to ourselves, and also we have to everyone around us. And I think this is also very important to understand that we practice. Sometimes we think we only practice for ourselves, but there is actually no distinction between us and other people and other beings. If like the good karma that we create, it benefits everybody. It benefits us, and at the same time, it benefits everyone else. So there is no distinction between us and others. We don't have to choose between us and others. Naturally, it will benefit everyone who we are in contact with. And Melissa Snow says, This is really good to hear. Much of my extended family has been ripped apart by politics, vaccines, and the pandemic. I just let them go because I'll have to let them go one day anyways. I'll love and release them. So yeah, I think this is a very common experience, especially now during this pandemic, that friends, family, neighbors, communities have been ripped apart because so many people have so many different views about the issue, and everybody's tightly clinging to their views. And this obviously has created a lot of tension, a lot of conflict. And we also know that because the pandemic has triggered a lot of insecurities in people, and all those fears and insecurities obviously make people cling even more tightly to the beliefs and to what they perceive as security. That because everything is because that fear is underlying everything, people are not actually able to rationally process things, and people are just clinging to their views and to their belief systems. So those fears are actually very similar to anger in the way that they really cloud our judgment and make us unable to see the bigger picture and make us unable to see other people's point of view. So what we can practice here is the Brahma Viharas, friendliness, so metta, compassion for the suffering of all those beings, because we can clearly see everybody suffering in this pandemic. Everybody who too tightly clings to their views about politics, about the pandemic, or whatever, is suffering a lot. So metta practice, karuna practice, very important. Even the other Brahma Viharas, equanimity. If you can't practice metta, then at least practice equanimity. Just to protect ourselves, protect our own mind, but also protect everyone else. If we try to oppose them, it would just fuel the tensions, and would just make them cling much more tightly to their views. So the best thing, as you say, Melissa, is to practice, to detach from those conversations and to practice the Brahma Viharas. Gita says, Aya, can we also see non-self to avoid conflict? Well, in some way, I think we can do that. Non-self obviously is much more difficult to practice than the Brahma Viharas usually. And the Buddha, like specifically for anger and ill will and hatred and those kind of negative emotions, the Buddha recommended metta practice. So because metta practice, friendliness is obviously, loving kindness is obviously directly opposed to hatred. Hatred is trying to harm others. Friendliness is trying to protect and save others. So these are directly opposed, and for that reason, it's clear that we can't have both in the mind at the same time. So if we have strong metta, anger will not arise. And as we have talked about before, anger really clouds our judgment. It really destroys our mindfulness. So when anger is there, it's really, really difficult to recollect about very abstract teachings such as non-self. For that reason, metta practice is often much easier to do when there is a conflict. But I mean, non-self is obviously also helpful. It's just that it's a little bit harder to do. And for that reason, the Buddha recommended metta practice. Joskar asks, did the Buddha give any advice for living in couples? Yes, the Buddha did teach couples also. Especially there is the most famous, most ideal couple, which is called Nakula Mata and Nakula Pita. So Nakula's mother and Nakula's father. Nakula was their son. And those are the ideal couple, and they live together very, very beautifully. So there are suttas that describe how they live together and how the Buddha taught them. Maybe at some point we can also read those suttas. Actually, they are on my to read with you list at some point. So maybe in a few months we'll read them. But yeah, there's definitely advice of the Buddha also about living in couples. So Sud asks, seems like metta is the antidote here, but does the Buddha give any tips on how to keep practicing metta even if one doesn't feel like it? Yeah, the trick is to do it very often. Whether or not you feel like it, just do it. In the beginning, it will be difficult to do because if we don't feel like it, it means we haven't developed the habit yet. So in our daily lives, we always cultivate habits. So the habits we have been formed over a long time, over months, over years, over decades, sometimes even over many lifetimes. And if we don't feel like practicing metta, it means we haven't developed the habit yet. So the more we practice it, the stronger the habit becomes. So over time, this will be a natural state of being. It would just be natural. It will be the habit of our mind to always cultivate metta. For that reason, it's very important that we regularly do it. Ideally, we should be doing it every single day in our practice, at least for part of the time. And even in our daily life, when we if we remember it, if we think about it, just practice metta for a short time, for a short while, sending metta to the beings that are around you or to yourself, so that the habit develops gradually over time. And once you have that habit, you won't feel like not doing it anymore, because the habit is just there. It's just natural for your mind to feel metta all the time. So that is the trick. Just do it, whether you feel like it or not. Just do it regularly all the time, as much as you can, until that habit becomes strong. Kita says they missed me on Sunday. That's lovely. I was very sick on Sunday. I was in bed with a fever, so I could not come, Gita. Well, there are many questions. I think I have to go a little bit faster. Dan says, Aya, on the going alone, living in share houses, there are situations with harmony and meditation. Then a new housemate may come in with hindrances. How I relate is up to me. It seems like maybe sangha. Yeah, exactly. This is like monastery life. That is why sangha life is so helpful for the development of the path. Some people imagine that sangha life means that everybody is living alone in a cave all the time and never seeing other people, but actually that's not at all true. Sangha life is living with very challenging housemates together in a monastery all the time, and sometimes you have a good group and then a new monastic comes in and everything gets derailed, because people are very different, and as monastics we don't choose the people that we live with. So we just live with anybody who's ordained and who needs a place to stay. So seems like very similar to your experience with living in share houses. And of course, the Buddha said, for that reason, the Buddha has taught those 6 principles of harmony, or of cordiality, as he called it, or as Bhikkhu Bodhi translated it. And for that reason, metta practice is so, so, so important, because that will protect your own mind, and that will create a beautiful atmosphere around you. And if your metta is strong, even if the other person feels aversion or ill will, they might be touched by those by that atmosphere of metta that you're creating around you, and that might sort of lessen their ill will. But even if it doesn't, and even if they do get angry with you, if your metta is strong, then that will not drag you down. Then your mind will remain bright and friendly and full of goodwill towards the other persons. So it doesn't drag you down. It doesn't impact on you all that much. So actually, Dan says, Sangha seems the best place to be. Wishing for connected communal life, I think I just addressed that. Even in monasteries, you can still encounter these issues with people coming and going, and you're not harmonizing with other people because everybody has a different personality and people are just different, and we don't connect with everybody in the same way. And as monastics, you really cannot pick who is coming and going. So For that reason, monastic life is such a good training, because if you want to be successful in monastic life, if you want to be happy, you have to develop on the path. You have to develop the Brahma Viharas. Otherwise, all this constant coming and going and living together with difficult people will make it very hard for you and will really impact on your mind. But if your metta is strong, then it really doesn't matter how difficult other people are. You really become independent because your own mind just remains bright, whatever the external conditions. So Sangha life is great, but it's not great for the reasons that you think. It's great because it is difficult and challenging, and because that will be what propels you forward on the path and what motivates you to practice metta. And Dan also asks, where is the line in too much going alone, especially with neoliberalism that atomizes people? Yeah, obviously, the Buddha was talking in a different time, in a time where everything was much more communal, where the families were much bigger. People usually lived together in like big family units with the grandparents and with guests and with like in very large households. And people had much closer connections with the neighbors and friends and so on. So obviously some of the Buddha's teaching about going alone is about, you know, people who are so much embedded in a community to just kind of get them to detach from that a little bit, whereas we are already very, very detached from our communities. So for us, learning to live in a community is actually much harder. That actually ties in well with what I just said about living in a community in the Sangha. Many of us, when we come to Sangha life, we have to learn how to live together because we really don't know. For us, it's easy to live alone, but it's difficult to live in community. Back then, that might have been the exact opposite. So, of course, for us, that needs to be balanced a little bit. So the important thing is we are practicing a middle path. So we're not veering to any extreme. People who are very attached to family and to their community need to learn to be alone. But people who are already very attached to being alone and who have an aversion towards other people and who find it very challenging to live with other people need to learn how to live with others. But also the important thing is that we live with the right people. So the Buddha says it over and over, there's no companionship with fools. And one of the principles of cordiality, the 6 principles, is that we live with people who are like-minded, who have the same view, especially if we practice Dharma, who have right view, who also, and who are virtuous, who keep the silas, who also are committed to the practice. If we spend too much time with people who are not keeping sila, who are not like-minded, who don't want to practice the path, then that can, because we're spending time with them, that can lead us to cultivating all sorts of unwholesome habits, because we are spending a lot of time doing those unwholesome things together with them. So it's important that we learn to live in communities, but it's also important that we pick the right people to live with. So that doesn't necessarily mean all the people that we like, doesn't necessarily only mean only people that sort of mesh well with our personality. As I just mentioned, in the Sangha, there are all sorts of people and we have to get along with all of them. But at least they are like-minded, at least they're trying to keep sila, at least they're having some sort of right view, or at least they're trying to develop right view. At least they think that Dharma is important and that practice is important to some extent. So we have to pick the people skillfully that we're spending time with. Some very nice messages here. So I'm glad that people are enjoying the talk, and I'm glad that this is helpful for some people. One person says, we would like, so Prashant says, we would like to hear you on Abhidhamma, to hear me on Abhidhamma. So I'm more of a Sutta and Vinaya person. This is really the teaching that I think I have some kind of expertise or that I'm comfortable talking about. Abhidhamma, I only have a very cursory acquaintance with, so I don't think I'm a good teacher on Abhidhamma. There are many, many much more accomplished people out there who can talk on Abhidhamma. I am much, much more inspired by the suttas and by the Vinaya, especially by the suttas. So I think I will stick to that for the time being and leave Abhidhamma to others. And that was the last question or comment so far. So we can end for today, and next time we will continue with that sutta, the Upakilesa Sutta, and we will finally read that section on communal harmony that we didn't get to read today. So I hope to see you all again next week. And for now, we will end with 3 sadhus. Feel free to join me if you like. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Have a good week, and I hope to see you all again next Tuesday.